Great to be here and getting to speak to you. So I am going to be talking about the XrmToolBox today. Um, and this one's going to be more of a really hands-on demo. So I've got a few little slides to go through, but the best part about learning about this tool is really just showing what it can do. And yeah, it's really, really powerful in what it can do. And I think that as more and more people are starting to adopt the Power Platform and specifically Dataverse inside of the Power Platform, there are many people that may not have necessarily be familiar with the tool sets and tools that are available for them. And so, the XrmToolBox is one that's actually been around for quite a long time. But yeah, many new people coming in won't have heard of it yet. So I am going to be talking about the XrmToolBox. So it is a community tool built for Microsoft Dataverse and Dynamics 365. Just maybe a little bit about me before I jump into it. So my name is Chris Piasecki. So I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. I know many of you are Calgary, but yeah, happy to be visiting here in your user group. I'm currently an independent consultant, working mainly with the Power Platform and Dynamics 365. I've worked for a large partner and consulting firm for the last 7.5 years. So just a couple months ago, actually, I decided to branch off and go sort of a solopreneur type of a role. So that's been a big shift for me. But yeah, I'm really enjoying it so far. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP, specializing in the Microsoft business applications. So as I mentioned, Power Platform, D365, specifically the customer engagement or CRM side of things, to be more specific, as Microsoft tends to, is confused with their product renaming, and Dynamics is kind of a larger umbrella that includes ERP and their AI stuff. But so specifically the CRM side is kind of where I focus on. For those that you want to connect with me, LinkedIn is probably your best bet. That's usually where I'm the most active. So feel free to add me on LinkedIn. So just search for me, Chris Piasecki. Probably the first name that pops up. And if you also want to follow me on Twitter, there's my handle there, though I'm probably a lot less frequently active there than I am on LinkedIn. So actually, yeah, Chris did bring up a slide on the Power Platform conference. For those that are planning to attend, I'm sure most of the people that are planning to attend probably have already booked their trip and got their tickets. But maybe for those that are still on the edge and deciding, if you do decide to go and you still need to get your pass, feel free to use a $100 discount code of mine to save a little bit off of your conference pass. So getting onto the actual XrmToolBox. So the XrmToolBox, as I mentioned, is a community built tool, effectively for the community. And why kind of the toolbox really exists is it kind of spans back, several years back in the early days of Dynamics CRM. Probably, I think version 4 is when this tool was first kind of introduced or made available for. And really what it came down to was that there was certain maybe features or capabilities that were not necessarily native or available inside of the platform, where there's maybe kind of pain points or was very tedious to do certain things. And the toolbox effectively became sort of a way to fill some of these productivity gaps and basically allowing developers, functional consultants, or app makers, admins, power users that are basically needing to do any sort of configuration or customization, development even, and other sorts of administrative tasks, and being able to actually do some of these a lot more efficiently and quickly, where they weren't able to necessarily do this inside of the Dynamics platform, which has actually evolved into, as we know today, Microsoft Dataverse. And so that's kind of where it got its roots, and it's continued to be relevant today, and it continues to evolve and serves a lot of different tasks, or fulfills a lot of different tasks and time-saving features. So it's one of my favorite tools. I personally use it to save, I don't know, I can't even count the number of hours and times. It's also saved my ass in a number of different scenarios where using the native platform features would have been very arduous or maybe not even necessarily possible without a lot of work. So maybe just kind of a quick, just to get kind of an idea for those in the room, who here has worked with the XRM Toolbox before and maybe knows it fairly well. And I guess this is going to be hard for me to see with no hands up because I am full screen in presentation mode. So Chris, I don't know if anyone raised their hands there.
I saw one hand just kind of go up really quickly and came back down. So it looks like one so far.
Okay, awesome. And how many of you have actually heard of the XRM Toolbox, but maybe have just getting started or haven't necessarily dived into it yet? I'm assuming a lot more hands are going to go up. Okay, I see. I saw one come up on my screen. I think I saw Brian's hand raised up. Okay, awesome. Okay, so hopefully then today's session will be very helpful for those that are going to kind of just getting started on their their journey learning Dataverse and to kind of figure out how they can be more productive in some of the more sort of tedious or redundant tasks that they'll end up finding themselves doing, whether they're building apps or having to kind of administer a environment that's using Dataverse, or maybe someone that's a developer that's just getting started with Dataverse. So as I mentioned, the XRM Toolbox is built by the community for the community. And here's just some kind of stats I've been able to pull up that kind of just really show the impact of this tool just over the past decade that it's been in use, right? Like back in 2012 is when it was created, like early in the CRM 4.0 days. So I mean, just the fact that it's still kind of relevant in use today is just quite amazing. So I mean, you've got over, I think 400 and I think over 440 when I last look of actual verified plugins that are authored. So what I mean by that is like the plugins actually go through a verification to be kind of made available in the tool library to be installed and used. So making sure that it kind of meets certain criteria and standards to make sure that it's compatible, not going to cause issues. And yeah, there's over 50 different developers or publishers that have authored these plugins in the community. So we have some really, really active people in the community and have just done an awesome job building some of these tools. And I mean, you can see just the impact that they have, as I mentioned, like it gets over 15,000 monthly installs of different plugins. It's been, the plugin or the toolbox itself has been launched over 300,000 times in the last month, and it's over 500,000 total downloads. So just to really, just kind of goes to show, how much of an impact a community tool can have. And, that impact isn't also recognized and noticed by also Microsoft themselves. Like if for those that have maybe working closely with Dataverse and Dynamics, you'll probably have seen the XRM Toolbox and its various plugins referenced all over official Microsoft documentation inside of Learn, as you see here. So I mean, even Microsoft themselves have recognized the value of the tool, and the interesting part too about I'd say the tool is that it's for better or worse, and this might be kind of maybe a slight to Microsoft product teams, but what we've seen in the past with some tools, like one of them, for example, the Ribbon Workbench is one of the most popular tools. It basically filled a gap that hasn't even necessarily been never really was filled up until recently. So Microsoft didn't even bother to build something native into the platform to work with working with command buttons and ribbons inside of the model-driven apps, because the toolkit was just so well used and so well done. And I guess they just decided to focus their efforts elsewhere because the community already filled that gap. And just until recently, when they launched the newer command bar designer that uses PowerFX, that's up until just recently, yeah, they had no real replacement or anything to provide native functionality. And we actually do see more and more of that today. In a lot of cases, we'll see Microsoft develop a certain new feature or capability to support something in the platform. But what they'll often do is to get sort of the feature out there and working, they'll build the API and the functionality underneath it, but they won't build a UI layer, or if they do, it's a very often a very minimal or rushed user experience. You could say. So, and in a lot of cases, they'll be community developers that will actually go out and build a plugin to actually help manage, build like some type of manager to work with this new feature and giving them people a user experience or UX to work with them, rather than only the programmatic approach, which again is not going to be accessible to anyone except for developers, which again it can be quite tedious and quite time consuming just to work with some feature. So that's kind of interesting sort of stance that Microsoft's sort of taken. We'll see, I guess that allows them to sort of iterate and rapidly get features out there, I suppose faster than build on it, but for better or worse. I guess that's where the community has really stepped up and filled in these gaps in the native platform. And the best sort of thing about the XrmToolBox is it is a free tool, and the original developers promised that it will continue to remain so. So that is another awesome thing about the toolbox. You don't have to go and pay for some third-party tool, in which there certainly are third-party tools out there to do certain tasks. But if you are finding that there's a gap in the platform in Dataverse that you can't necessarily achieve out of the box, you'll definitely want to check a look through the XrmToolBox and see if there's a plugin that can fulfill a gap before going and maybe purchasing a third-party tool. So what can we do with the XrmToolBox? Well, as I mentioned, it has over 440 published and verified plugins available, and all across different sorts of categories. So as I mentioned, it can do things to help with sort of configuration and customization. So whether that's doing things to help with all the different metadata in your environment. So whether that's using something like the attribute manager to quickly and easily build up your data model and create columns quickly in your Dataverse. As for those that are familiar, having to create a large number of tables and columns can be quite tedious, right? If you're having to create a whole new table with 40 fields while going through the user interface and clicking and entering in, 40, 50 times can be quite tedious. And so obviously, to fill that gap, the community has built something called the attribute manager, where you can basically take your data model and generates a nice little Excel template where you pick all your data types, the name, and all the other sort of attributes. So then you can effectively just bulk load that Excel template in, and it'll basically create all of that data model for you. So that's like a completely huge time saver, as you can imagine, when you're early on, developing your data model and actually need to go and implement that data model. It can save like several hours. I know it has for me in the past, and also making sure that there's some consistency as well, kind of apply to all of your data model. It can also provides a means to work with things like translations, which something that's not been made easily available with Microsoft. You kind of have to export this giant translation file that can take hours to re-import, and so there's a tool that's made it so you can kind of import certain pieces at a time and translations for certain components, rather than this all or nothing sort of approach that Microsoft's provided. So that's lots of examples where it's making it easier to work with your data model and all the different configurations in your system, but also for even doing things like data management or data analysis. So being able to quickly query your tables using their proprietary XML, which is not necessarily intuitive to work with. It takes a while to get used to, and actually having a tool that can build those queries for you, test it, and move it across is a huge time saver. Or for some people like developers or data analysts and those that actually have a SQL background, someone has actually created a tool that allows you to work with native SQL as if you're in SQL Management Studio. And actually this particular one is actually an extension for SQL Management Studio, but is also built into the toolbox. And it basically takes sort of SQL statements and translates them into either native fetch XML queries for retrieval or API calls to do any sort of modifying of data, so your normal CRUD operation. So that's really awesome. And when it comes to things like administration, being able to check comparing access management, so comparing roles or checking if security roles have consistent privileges applied, or what sort of privileges do they have applied, because again, in the out of the box administrative interface, it's not necessarily the most intuitive way to view or even see side by side comparing one role over another. So they provide a much easier interface to actually do comparisons and see what where differences there are. So And there's even tools that actually help you building documentation, which we know is, a very tedious task, like being able to actually take your data model and build an entity relationship diagram as you would for any sort of custom systems, actually being able to take all of your metadata, your entity metadata, your table definitions, column definitions, even identifying like foreign keys, primary keys, including that detail, and actually generate a diagram out for you with the connections that you can then kind of work with and tweak is just a really awesome time saver. So again, I can probably go on just for an hour just talking about every single plugin. And I do plan to actually walk through a few of these plugins just to show you in detail just the power of what it can do. But yeah, there's just so many awesome things I won't be able to show you today, but we'll see how much we can get through. So with that, let's actually show you how this works in action. So I'm just going to switch from my PowerPoint and let's bring up the actual toolbox itself. So actually, first I'm going to hop over to my web browser. So in terms of where can you actually get this tool? So again, you can just navigate over to the www.XrmToolBox.com. And you can see here, they'll have the latest version that you'll be able to download. And so the toolbox itself is a Windows-based application, so use Windows Form. So that's one sort of thing you do need to keep in mind, is that if you are on a Mac user, unfortunately, unless you have Windows, side by side loaded onto your MacBook, you're not going to be able to use it. But most of the usual users in the enterprise are likely going to be on Windows. So that is sort of the only sort of crux of it or prerequisite of it. But again, it is completely free. So all you have to really do is just download it. And the nice thing is it doesn't actually need to quote unquote install anything. It's basically a zip file where you can then take sort of an extract and then run the executable. So I mean, some security admins maybe the security admins may not necessarily like that because it's as a way to maybe get around installation, but in other ways it is kind of easier to get access to it and get it up and running. So I mean, you can just basically take and download that and extract it to anywhere sort of on your machine. And then I typically like to bookmark or pin the executable to like your start menu, for example, that's to make it easily accessible. So let's actually jump over to the toolbox itself. And I do apologize for all the different screen switching, just to make it a little bit easier, because sharing my widescreen isn't going to provide the best experience. So, okay. And how's the visibility on that? Is that decent size? Is that coming through okay?
It's a little small, but if you don't have an easy way to fix it, don't worry about it.
Okay. Yeah, that's the other little thing is scaling up the size. I don't believe the native controls work there. So yeah, I think I'm already also scaled up to 125% on my Windows, but my apologies for that.
Good enough.
So yeah, so the first thing you kind of see when you launch the toolbox is you get this nice little start page, and you'll actually see things like your most recently used tools. So you can see all the different plugins that I've opened recently, and even seeing which environment, Power Platform environment that I've connected to. So you can easily quickly relaunch and get back into something if you're wanting to reopen and reuse that tool that you were just last in. And then you can even pin things like your favorite plugins for also quick and easy access, so that it's kind of always pinned and always available because you know that it's a particular tool on a daily basis. And often the times that is pretty true for some of these particular tools. And then what's also this tools tab. So this is going to show you all of your different tools that you have installed. And out of the box, there's going to be over 30 plugins installed right off the bat here. So you'll see by the XrmTools publisher, that's the creator of the XrmToolBox. So they've shipped 30 plugins already out of the box that are really good. But then you can go in and install, of course, plugins from other publishers and ones that you want to use. And they do a nice job of actually categorizing these based on sort of the tags or what sort of areas these plugins apply to. So you can easily go in and filter by these different categories for things like configuration, or maybe something to do with like data management, security, and so on. This clicking applies multiple filters, so that's interesting. But yeah, you can see ones that are good for looking at security, you can look at your user roles manager, for example. So that's kind of nice. So, and the nice thing is you can actually go and configure this, and I'll show you kind of some of the different settings that you have available to kind of customize your toolbox experience. But right now I can see I have mine, I think, sorted by my most favorites or most recently used, I believe. It's kind of sorted like that, but you could change it to sort of like alphabet, for example. And it's of course easy enough to search for the different tool that you want, and it'll autocomplete. So it's very quick to find, to get to all of your tools if you're like me and have quite a lot of them installed. Though I wouldn't recommend just going and installing every plugin. And then you have what's called the tool library, and this is where you actually can go and find other available tools that are out there in there. And so you can search by a whole bunch of different by the different categories, as I talked about. And you can find ones that maybe I want to look for ones that are related to Power BI. So there's a Power BI XrmToolBox plugin that allows you to embed Power BI reports into a Dataverse form, or even helping with Power Query MBuilder scripts, which is kind of neat. So I imagine that'll be for those that are on this call, I'm sure are very much in the Power BI space. So those sort of things will be like, oh, very cool. But you also can apply other sorts of filters. Like again, most of these tools are going to be built open source. There's a very few that might be closed source where the developer hasn't necessarily made it open, but in most cases they're going to be open source, and you'll be actually able to go to the GitHub repo and actually view the source code, which is nice. You can filter ones from ones that are built by Microsoft MVP specifically. I mean, a lot of these publishers are MVPs, as you can see, but of course there's also some really great tools built by those that are non-MVPs. And then you can kind of filter by things that are top rated, new, or even and also filters tools that maybe you already have not installed, so you don't want to see things that you're already installed in there. But let's jump over to actually one of the plugins and see kind of just what you can do with this. So one of the most popular ones is really like working with data and being able to quickly query data in the system. And Microsoft's certainly come a long way with sort of the new experience inside of Dataverse, where you have this what's called the table hub, so you can actually browse your tables, and they do have basically sort of a grid where they'll get like the top 50 rows, and you can do filtering and stuff like that directly inside of the portal. But again, that's still quite limited, and in terms of any sort of advanced querying, that's difficult to do. And then also, if you need to be able to build views and other things, again, Fetch XML Builder's really going to help with that. So let's take a look into that. So whenever you're opening a tool for the sort of the first time, once you've opened it, it's going to ask you, do you want to connect to an organization first? And that's going to really, what that means is an environment that's enabled for Dataverse. So of course, we're going to go ahead and click yes. And you can see here you have this, what's this called, this sort of little connection manager. And if you're visiting this for the first time, of course, you'll have to kind of create a new connection. And I'll kind of go into this a little bit after I've gone through some of the plugins, but it provides you a really nice way to organize all of your different connections and group them. And so I'm just going to go to my MVP Dev Tenants, and we'll go ahead and connect into there. And some of these plugins may have like sort of little information pages. In this case, the publisher actually provides their release notes, which is helpful to see actually what's changed in recent versions and things they fixed and so on. So that's kind of nice. So so this particular one is this one allows you to basically build your Fetch XML query. So if you've ever seen what a Fetch XML looks like, well, it is kind of what it sounds like. It's XML, but it's basically proprietary. It has this whole sort of querying language around it, which is kind of a little daunting, especially if you're just getting started with Dataverse. So what you can rather do is use a GUI to actually help you construct that query easily. So we can go ahead and actually say, if we wanted to look at the contact table, we can go from there. I can start to go and pick, maybe what are the different attributes that I want to select. I can, select them all, but maybe I just want to get like the full name, phone number, maybe I want to get their address, so on and so forth. So let's select a few sort of things here. So you can see all the different attributes that you basically want to be retrieving. So that'll be like kind of like your select query, what columns you want. Then you can actually go and start to add things like filtering capabilities. So maybe I want to filter on, maybe I want to find contacts that are their city is equal to, say, I don't know, Seattle, for example. You can add in that filter, and then you'll see it'll actually add in that filter condition for you. So again, you're not having to remember all the different syntax and things that are available. So yeah, it supports other things as well, like being able to do things like distinct, aggregation as well. So if you want to get like doing like summation or certain other aggregates and grouping across your data, you can do that. Of course, the fetch XML language itself is certainly limited. You can't do very complex sorts of queries and joins, but anything that does support, you'll be able to do that inside of the fetch XML builder. And a really nice bonus sort of thing about this tool is that it also actually helps you convert that query into, say, something, if you wanted to perhaps make a web API call directly. So it actually gets you the OData syntax, and you can see here on the bottom, you can copy that. And if I put that into the browser and that I'm logged into, it would be able actually to run that query against the API and return sort of the JSON sort of response as if you're querying the web API. Or another really common use case is if you ever worked with the Dataverse connector inside of Power Automate, you may have noticed that having to do any sort of filtering on your queries when you're retrieving a list of records, you actually have to specify OData syntax, which can be a bit, again, daunting for non-developers. So it'll actually go and create basically the list rows parameters that you would effectively enter in. So you can actually just check this and actually copy it, or take the filter, the OData filtering syntax, and just copy it in there and paste that into your Power Automate options, and away you go. So that's a super useful feature. That's probably one of the most used features, I'd say, about this tool. But yeah, so I mean, you can go ahead and basically execute that query. I'm not sure. I got a bit of sample data in this environment, so I'm not sure if that'll bring any rows back. Oh, well, I got a few sample records that are have contacts in Seattle. So there you go. So again, and you can basically take that data and put that to your clipboard. If you wanted to bring it over to Excel to do some more analysis, you can certainly do that too. So that's kind of the Fetch XML builder, another really popular one. Another one that I actually find myself using the most is actually the SQL for CDS tool, for those that maybe prefer to do SQL and maybe are more efficient running SQL queries on the command or in the prompt rather than using a GUI, because again, even clicking around takes time. So I mean, for those that are comfortable with doing SQL, you can actually go and do that, and you can see that it brings up your Object Explorer. And again, if you're familiar with SQL Management Studio, this will look kind of familiar for you. So you have like your entities, that'll be like your tables, and you can again just kind of browse into that and expand it just as you would see in a normal sort of SQL database. You got things like your attributes and things like that, and it's even got IntelliSense built in, so it'll actually help with building your queries. So if like you're going from contact, you'll actually get the IntelliSense on all of your different columns, like their schema names and everything. And so that's really super useful, and especially when you have to do sort of maybe ad hoc data modification, whereas maybe sometimes in the user interface you're not able to easily do that. You might be able to go and do a sort of an ad hoc data fix, which I actually had to do on a customer project just recently when we were doing a production deployment. I had to do some modifying to populate a new column that we added as part of the deployment, and all the existing records didn't have any data, and so we had to kind of go through and do a script to populate that data, where it would have been much more inefficient to maybe have to go through the sort of Excel bulk modification where we're exporting data and re-importing data, which is tedious, and of course a little more error prone because there's a little bit more manual massaging. So again, being able to do SQL queries directly against your tables is super helpful. it's got a nice, all these sorts of little options too, and some really nice important features like we see here. This bypass custom plugins here is, for example, if you have any sort of workflows or synchronous plugins that would normally trigger when you're updating a record, you have the option to bypass that, and that's usually something you typically want to do if you're doing like a data migration, for example. It's that same sort of thing where you might want to, might not want to trigger the workflows to update data, because usually your data migration would sort of account for that sort of end state of the record. So doing any sort of bulk update, you can bypass your plugins and also improve the performance. So it's got nice little options there. You can kind of decide how you want to batch your records so that instead of making, individual calls for every query or every update that you're doing, you can batch them in, say, 100 or 50 records, and that'll increase your throughput. So it's really, really nice, super useful feature. And again, as you can see, it looks exactly like SSMS. You can get your queries, and you can copy with headers, and basically go and bring that to Excel or do whatever you want with that. So that's really awesome. And you can even open multiple query windows. And the nice thing with this unique tool specifically, you can actually have different environment connections sort of open at the same time, which is kind of different from some of the other plugin windows. You'd have to open a whole new kind of tab to maybe open another instance of the tool, for example. But this one, actually, you can have multiple sort of query windows with different environments all within sort of the same window, which is actually a nice another little feature that I kind of wanted to point out, is that you can basically duplicate, opening another instance or tab of this for maybe side-by-side comparison, but you can also duplicate the tool with the new connection, or you can even change your existing connection. For example, if you're connected to your dev environment, maybe you want to go and run this query on, say, your test environment and something like that, you can easily switch your connection over to doing that. How are we doing on time? We've got about 20 minutes. So maybe before I jump into maybe showing another tool, I just want to spend a little bit of time going through some of the features that, that of actually using the tool itself and setting it up to be more productive. But also, again, there's some little maybe hidden tips and tricks that maybe others aren't necessarily familiar with. Now, the nice thing is the toolbox did actually go through some sort of UX refresh or enhancement. So there's been a lot of little UX changes that makes it look a lot more, I'd say, prettier. Of course, as pretty as a Windows Forms tool can look today, but the developer definitely made put in a lot of hard work to make things a lot easier. And the one thing I want to point out specifically is around managing connections. So you have the sort of connections here that you can manage from the bottom. You can always see like which environment you're connected to within a particular window. You can change over to that connection, of course, in the middle, and then update any of your open tabs. Like if I wanted to say I wanted to connect to a different environment, I can switch that, and then it will ask you, oh, do you want to change your connections for all the different tabs and tools that you have open? So maybe I want to switch to a different environment for all my tabs because I'm using them all at the same time. Then I can do that, or I can just pick and choose which ones I want, or not even change any of them at all, and just any new tabs I open will use that new connection. But if we go over into this manage connections area, so this is like a little connection manager wizard where you can create sort of a new connections file. And this is a nice way to basically organize and group your connections, especially for those that are like consultants, maybe working with a lot of different clients, or maybe you're an administrator managing a large amount of environments in your enterprise. You can group them up by sort of any way that you want. Maybe you have maybe a set of environments that are just for your dev, UAT, test, production. You can segment them out that way. Maybe one's for a set of connections for a particular enterprise application that has maybe multiple environments. You can organize in that way. Or if you're a consultant like me, you might have different connections or connection files for different customers or clients that you're working with. And so you can go ahead and create basically a new connection file, give it a name. And the one thing that I always recommend doing is basically to save your connection file somewhere that's kind of remote and you can easily access it. So like something like a OneDrive is a convenient place to store it. Or if you want to actually share out the connection file, so say if you're using a service principal to connect to some of your environments or your clients' environments rather than individuals, then you can kind of actually share out that connection file so that everyone can use that service principal actually connect out. So rather than everyone having to maintain their own version of a connection file, you can actually go and share that out. So I always, generally recommend to go and store it somewhere on your OneDrive. So I can go in and actually go into my OneDrive and import my connection file from there. In this particular case, sorry, this is to create a new one. So I would always recommend creating in there, but you can also import in a connection file from somewhere else. So if I just wanted to edit this particular one, you can see that mine's path sort of to my locally. It's got my locally drive map to OneDrive, but it's connected to my OneDrive, so I don't have to store it locally. And if you're moving to a new machine, you have that backed up. You don't have to recreate your connection. So that's really nice. You can even give it a nice little sort of image or an icon to sort of, I don't know, just to help to distinguish between your different connection files and organize it, which is nice. And then when it comes to actually creating a new connection, so you get this whole slew of options to connect to it. And usually the easiest one you want to use is the Microsoft login control, which I'll use for a lot of cases. But in some cases, you might want to use a service principal to connect, where you can use a client ID secret combination. But in most cases, you're going to use the login control. Then you can basically have, it uses the Microsoft's built-in login control. So in my particular case, I can, my tenant sitting in Office 365, not the Dynamics on premises, and you can say display your different lists of organizations. So if I went to my demo tenant, I could log in with that. Just gotta push the MFA on here. And you can actually see all of the different environments. My particular Dev Tenant only has a few of environments here, but you can say pick a particular environment. Well, in that particular case, something's wrong with that environment, probably. Oh, you're not going to make me log in again, are you? Okay, and then I'm just going to cancel out of this particular one, but I could say if I wanted to go in and edit this particular one, I could go in and give it a custom name. And the other nice really thing I like about the environment is that you can actually set up things like highlighting information to distinguish the type of environment is. So, I'm sure many people, if you've been working with SQL, for example, I'm sure some of you here have maybe accidentally ran a query or an update statement or something against the wrong environment without realizing that maybe they're meant to update dev and they're accidentally in production. It certainly happens. So actually being able to have that highlight, as you can see here over the top, I typically maybe tend to call my dev environments or put my dev environments as green. And you can even put some kind of custom text around it, saying like this is a dev type of environment, and use that environment, and it'll actually highlight that. So whenever you're working within a particular window, especially with your multiple connections, it's easy to distinguish and not make that mistake. A nice also new feature that they introduced is the ability to also set a browser profile on that. So some of the tools will actually allow you, when you're, say, selecting records like solutions or even data records, you can actually click on them and it'll open the browser to it. But a lot of the time, if you're running with multiple windows and browser profiles, and it's gonna often ends up opening the wrong one, which is super annoying, and you have to log in, or you're logged into the wrong one and you get unauthorized. So you can actually set the browser profile to actually use. So actually not just the browser profile, but the type of browser. So in this case, I use Edge, and I can choose any of my existing browser profiles that I want. And it'll actually be able to do that. And you can test it, and it would basically open up, as you saw there, opening my right browser profile tab, and ensure that you can get access to that without having to switch. So that's super useful. And then you can, if you decide you want to reorganize your connections, maybe, I don't know, for whatever reason, you accidentally created them in the default connection folder by default, and you want to move them into a new one you've created to reorganize, you can easily go in and do that by moving the selected connections, or maybe, move them into a different one, or, vice versa. And then you can even clone a particular connection if you wanted as well, to make things easier. Maybe you need to, maybe you just want to quickly create one and then change some of the org details, but maybe the connection or authentication details will be the same. So you can quickly clone connections as well that way. So that's a big part of that is kind of managing connections, and I find that super useful, and a lot of new little features that have made it a lot easier to work with that. Just kind of jump into my notes here. Another sort of area that you'll kind of work with is changing some of the different settings within your toolbox. So there's this whole sort of settings area where you can go and change sort of various settings throughout the toolbox. So you'll have things like the repository URL. So this is this actually allows for those that are admins that maybe wants to lock down sort of the use of the XRM toolbox. They could maybe limit, they don't want them to go to the public repository that has all the plugins, but maybe they decide to use their own private repository. They can basically go and point the users to a particular repository URL. And then there's also, that's something that can be pushed through like a registry setting as well to basically restrict what repositories they have available. So for admins that maybe want to have more tighter control in a more highly regulated environment, can do that, which is kind of nice. There's some kind of sort of startup settings where you can always check for updates. You can also make it so that the tools library always shows first. I actually always by default don't want to launch the tool library first and have that, so I usually toggle that, things like that off. You can kind of customize how you want to use your connection. So for example, reusing your connections, if you're already connected to an organization, should it create sort of a new connection object in the background or reuse the same connection? And that can, you know, be beneficial or not, because if you want to easily switch and have multiple connections open, it might be easier to not reuse the same connection. There's things like they do, I think, have a, the theming. I've actually haven't really toggled with this. I haven't noticed really much of a dark theme here. As you can see, everything's still kind of white on white, but maybe if the tool, I think the plugin themselves supports dark theme, it could use that. There's also things like changing the path to where your XRM folder is. So you'll see kind of by default, it usually puts in like your local users directory inside of your app data roaming. But again, you might want to change that to somewhere a little bit more easy to find, whether that's somewhere central on your C drive. You could also point it to a OneDrive. If you want to like back up your plugins and all that, I typically, I'm kind of on the fence on whether you want to necessarily do that, and backing up all of these binaries and stuff to a particular OneDrive or something that might not even, I don't know how necessarily effective that will be, but you do have the option to do that if you like. So that's kind of what, there's a whole bunch of other sort of little settings in here, but usually it's around like sort of the default behavior of your toolbox as you're kind of launching things up. And so I usually recommend tweaking a few of those options. There's a few other little options that you'll also see that are common within all of the plugins. And one of the really useful features I found is the impersonate feature. So it's kind of exactly as it sounds like. You can impersonate or run the operation as another user in the environment. Now, of course, impersonate is something that you require in Dataverse to have the security role permissions in order to do that. And of course, impersonating doesn't give you more privileges than that user has. So you basically only effectively do what you can do, but as that user. And that might be useful for a number of different reasons, whether maybe you're trying to troubleshoot a user not being able to see certain data. You can actually do like a fetch XML query and impersonating as that user to see what kind of records they would see. Or maybe you're wanting to create a bulk delete job inside of Dataverse that you want it to always run, and maybe you want to ensure that that runs under a service account, so that if you leave the organization, that job doesn't fail. So you might want to use the impersonate feature for that purpose. So there's a lot of useful scenarios, I'm sure, that you could also think of that impersonation is useful. So it's very easy to just simply flip that on. And as long as you have that privilege in that particular environment, you can impersonate another individual. So I can, for example, look for, who do I have in here? I think I've got a Michael Scott in here. So yeah, I can go ahead and impersonate Michael Scott in my environment, and you can actually see across the top that you're impersonating as that user. And then you can easily toggle that off once you're done. Another, important kind of bit, as I mentioned, this is sort of a tool for the community by the community. It is, I mentioned a lot of these are open source, but also they're also very responsive and always looking for feedback and ways to improve. So the nice thing is that you can hit this help menu, and either you can get help for the XrmToolBox and you can get directly to there, or if you're directly within a particular plugin, it'll actually show you the help link directly for that plugin. So in this case, for SQL for CDS, it'll take you to wherever they've configured their help page. In this case, it's usually going to be the GitHub repository where it can basically leave or log an issue or a bug or feedback or something like that. And I don't always recommend to, if you have feedback if something's not working, to always provide that feedback for the developer so that they can improve the plugins in general. I'm probably gonna use this opportunity to stop here and maybe take any questions. Obviously, I would have loved to show more plugins, and I could have probably gone for hours of all the different capabilities that the XrmToolBox has, but we're probably gonna call it here for today.